October 14th, 1817. The Pemberton ballroom glittered like a jewel box that evening, its chandeliers cascading light across silks and satins, in every shade permitted to respectable ladies of quality. The orchestra played Mozart with precision, each note floating above the hum of conversation and the whisper of dancing slippers across polished floors. Eleanor Hartley stood at the periphery of this glittering world, a place she had occupied at every society gathering her father's wealth could purchase entrance to, and she had long since made peace with her position there. She was 26 years old, a fact that made her practically ancient by the cruel calculus of the marriage market, and she possessed neither the pedigree nor the ethereal beauty that might have compensated for her inadequate bloodline. Her father, Thomas Hartley, had made his fortune in textiles and shipping, respectable trades that filled coffers but could never fill the void where noble ancestry ought to reside. Eleanor knew what the ladies whispered behind their fans when she passed. Too tall, they said, and too direct in her manner of speaking. Her eyes were an unremarkable brown, her figure too slender to be fashionable, her complexion merely adequate, despite never having labored in the sun. She had been educated beyond what was proper for a woman, could discuss philosophy and literature with an enthusiasm that made gentlemen uncomfortable, and she lacked the simpering deference that might have softened these deficiencies. She had learned to accept her invisibility, even to find a strange comfort in it, for if one expected nothing, disappointment became impossible. Tonight she wore a gown of pale blue silk that had cost her father more than some families earned in a year, but she knew it would make no difference. She was watching the dancers with the bittersweet appreciation of someone observing a world through glass when she first noticed him across the room. Alexander Ravenscroft, Duke of Ravenscroft, stood in conversation with Lord Pemberton and his daughter, the incomparable Lady Margaret Pemberton. Eleanor knew who he was, of course. Everyone knew the Duke. At 32, he remained London's most eligible bachelor, his continued unmarried state a source of speculation and hope among ambitious mothers throughout England. This evening, according to the gossip Eleanor had already overheard, he was expected to finally make his offer to Lady Pemberton, a match so perfect in its symmetry of rank and fortune that it seemed inevitable. Eleanor allowed herself to study him for just a moment. He was handsome in the classical manner, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair touched with distinguished silver at the temples. But it was something in his expression that caught her attention, a quality she recognized because she had seen it in her own mirror. He looked profoundly alone despite being surrounded by society's finest. As if feeling her gaze, his eyes suddenly lifted and met hers across the crowded ballroom. Eleanor's breath caught. For one impossible moment, the music and the crowd seemed to fade. And there was only that connection, that unexpected recognition passing between two people who should have remained strangers. Then someone spoke to him, breaking the spell. And Eleanor looked away, her heart beating foolishly fast, already scolding herself for daring to imagine that such a moment could mean anything at all. Alexander stood motionless for several heartbeats after their eyes met, aware that Lord Pemberton was still speaking beside him, but unable to process the words. There was something in the way that woman had looked at him, not with the calculated assessment he had grown accustomed to from society ladies measuring his worth in titles and estates, but with a startling directness that seemed to see past his position to something more fundamental. He found himself curious in a way he had not been curious about anything in a very long time. His life had become a series of obligations and expectations, each day measured out in dutiful calls and appropriate conversations. And he had been standing here this evening, steeling himself to fulfill yet another duty by offering for Lady Pemberton, a woman he respected but could never love. Yet now he felt a sudden wild impulse to do something entirely unexpected. He excused himself from Lord Pemberton with a murmured apology, and began walking across the ballroom floor, dimly aware of the heads turning to follow his progress, the whispers beginning to ripple outward from his path like stones thrown into still water. The young woman had looked away, her cheeks flushed, and was now studying the floor with apparent fascination. As he drew closer, he could see she was taller than fashionable, her figure slender in a pale blue gown that was expensive but not ostentatious, her dark hair arranged simply, without the elaborate styles other ladies favored. When he stopped before her, she looked up with an expression of such genuine surprise that he found himself smiling. "May I have the honor of this dance, miss?" he said, realizing even as he spoke that he did not know her name. She stared at him as though he had addressed her in a foreign language. "I believe you are mistaken, sir," she said quietly, her voice low and pleasant. "I am certain there are many ladies far more deserving of your attention." He held out his hand. "I am not mistaken. Will you dance with me?" It was not really a question. She glanced around as if seeking rescue, then back at his outstretched hand. "I am Eleanor Hartley," she said, and he understood immediately what she was telling him. Hartley, the merchant family. She was warning him of her unsuitability. "I am Ravenscroft," he replied simply. "And I would very much like to dance with you, Miss Hartley, if you will permit me." She hesitated one moment longer, then placed her gloved hand in his with a delicacy that suggested she expected him to withdraw the offer at any second. He led her on to the floor as the orchestra began a waltz, and when he placed his hand at her waist and took her other hand in his, he felt her trembling slightly. They began to move together, and he found she danced well, following his lead with natural grace. "Where did you learn to waltz so beautifully?" he asked. "My father hired a dancing master," she said, a touch of defensiveness in her tone. "He believed it important that I be properly educated in all the accomplishments." "Then your father is a wise man." She looked at him directly then, searching his face for mockery and apparently finding none. "You are very kind, Your Grace." As they turned across the floor, he asked her about music, about literature, and found her answers thoughtful and articulate, delivered without simpering or false modesty. The dance ended too quickly. He bowed over her hand and she curtsied, and before he could stop himself, he leaned close and whispered, "I should very much like to speak with you again, Miss Hartley." Then he released her hand and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the center of the ballroom, touching her fingers to her lips as though she had just witnessed something impossible. Eleanor made her way back to where her father stood, near the refreshment table, her legs unsteady beneath her gown, and Thomas Hartley turned to her with an expression of barely suppressed jubilation that made her feel suddenly exposed and uncomfortable. "My dear," he said, gripping her arm with more force than necessary, "the Duke of Ravenscroft himself dancing with you. Do you understand what this could mean for our family, for our position?" Eleanor gently extracted her arm from his grasp, feeling a wave of something between embarrassment and sadness wash over her. "Father, please, it was merely a dance. Nothing more," she said quietly, but even as she spoke the words, she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, could hear the whispers beginning to circulate through the ballroom like a cold wind. Two ladies stood not 10 feet away, their fans raised to conceal their mouths, but not their voices, which carried with perfect clarity across the space between them. "Can you imagine," one said, "a merchant's daughter dancing with Ravenscroft? The presumption is absolutely breathtaking." The other replied with a laugh like breaking glass, "I suppose when one reaches her age without any prospects, desperation leads to all manner of inappropriate behavior, though I cannot fathom what possessed his grace to indulge such pretension." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, but she kept her expression carefully neutral, a skill she had perfected over years of enduring such observations. She glanced across the room and saw Lady Margaret Pemberton standing beside her father, her beautiful face arranged in an expression of icy composure, but her eyes, when they met Eleanor's for just a moment, held something that looked very much like contempt mixed with triumph. Eleanor suddenly needed air, needed to escape the suffocating weight of all those stares and whispers. She murmured an excuse to her father and made her way through the crowd toward the terrace doors, keeping her head high even as she heard her name repeated in various tones of shock and disapproval. The cool October air struck her face as she stepped outside, and she gripped the stone balustrade with both hands, drawing deep breaths and trying to calm the chaotic beating of her heart. She had been foolish, so foolish, to allow herself even a moment of hope, to imagine that a single dance could mean anything beyond a duke's momentary whim, or perhaps his misguided attempt at charity toward someone he perceived as pitiable. Of course it could lead nowhere. The gulf between their worlds was not merely wide, but absolute, reinforced by centuries of tradition and the iron laws of society that no amount of wishing could bend. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Caroline Wentworth, her dearest friend, approaching with concern written across her gentle features. Caroline had married a younger son of good family 3 years prior and occupied that comfortable middle space in society that allowed her to move between worlds more freely than Eleanor ever could. "Oh, my dear," Caroline said softly, taking Eleanor's hands in her own. "That was quite the spectacle. Half the ballroom is in an uproar." Eleanor managed a weak smile. "I should not have accepted. It was a mistake." Caroline studied her face carefully. "Did it feel like a mistake when you were dancing with him?" Eleanor looked away, unable to answer, because the truth was that for those few minutes in Alexander Ravenscroft's arms, she had felt something she had never expected to feel. Had felt seen and valued and impossibly alive. Inside, standing at one of the tall windows overlooking the terrace, Alexander watched Eleanor's solitary figure against the balustrade and felt something tighten in his chest, a protective instinct he had not known he possessed. And he found himself resolving that this would not be the last time he spoke with Eleanor Hartley. Consequences be damned. 3 days passed in which Eleanor told herself repeatedly that she must put the entire incident out of her mind, must recognize it for what it was, a moment of inexplicable kindness from a man whose world would never intersect with hers in any meaningful way again. And she had almost succeeded in convincing herself that she felt nothing but mild gratitude tinged with embarrassment when the butler appeared in the morning room where she sat attempting to focus on her embroidery and announced in a voice that barely concealed his astonishment that His Grace the Duke of Ravenscroft had called and requested an audience with the family. Eleanor felt the needle slip from her fingers and heard her father, who had been reviewing accounts at his desk, leap to his feet with such enthusiasm that his chair toppled backward onto the carpet. "Show His Grace in immediately," Thomas Hartley commanded, his hands already smoothing his waistcoat and adjusting his cravat. And then he turned to Eleanor with an expression of such naked ambition that she felt something shrivel inside her chest. "Compose yourself, girl," he hissed. "This is the opportunity of a lifetime. Do not say anything foolish." Eleanor had no time to respond before Alexander Ravenscroft entered the room, and she found herself rising automatically, dropping into a curtsy while her mind raced trying to understand why he had come. He looked exactly as she remembered, tall and elegant in a dark blue coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his expression polite but reserved, as Thomas Hartley launched into an effusive welcome that made Eleanor want to sink through the floor. "Your Grace, what an unexpected honor. You do us such kindness by calling. Please sit, may we offer you tea? My daughter will pour, Eleanor. Where are your manners?" Eleanor moved to the tea service with hands that trembled slightly. hyper-aware of Alexander settling into the chair her father indicated, of the way her father positioned himself between them like a guardian protecting treasure, of the absurdity of this entire situation. She poured tea with careful precision, willing her voice to steadiness as she asked how he preferred it prepared, and when she handed him the cup their fingers brushed for the briefest instant, and she felt that same electric awareness she had experienced during their dance. They endured 20 minutes of awkward conversation, during which Thomas dominated the discussion, boasting about his business ventures and connections, while Eleanor sat in mortified silence. But then Alexander did something unexpected. He set down his teacup and said with perfect courtesy, "Mr. Hartley, I understand you have an impressive library. I have heard it mentioned in several circles, and I wonder if Miss Hartley might show me the collection. I have a great passion for books, and would value her perspective on your acquisitions." Thomas looked momentarily stunned that his daughter, rather than himself, was being requested as guide, but his desire to please the Duke overrode any propriety concerns, and he agreed with an eagerness that made Eleanor cringe inwardly. She led Alexander to her father's library, a room she had always loved for its tall windows and the smell of leather and paper, and the moment the door closed behind them, she felt the atmosphere shift into something more intimate and dangerous. Alexander moved to the nearest shelf, but did not look at the books, instead turning to face her directly. "Miss Hartley, I have not been able to stop thinking about our conversation the other evening," he said quietly, "and I find myself hoping very much that you might indulge my company again. Would you permit me to call on you?" Eleanor stared at him, searching his face for some indication that this was a cruel jest or a misunderstanding, but she found only sincerity and something that looked remarkably like hope, and before she could stop herself, she said yes. Alexander returned to Ravenscroft House that evening, with his thoughts still full of Eleanor Hartley, of the way her eyes had lit when discussing poetry, of the intelligence and warmth that radiated from her despite society's determination to render her invisible. And he was still smiling slightly when he entered the grand foyer, only to find his mother waiting for him in the drawing-room with an expression that could have frozen the Thames in midsummer. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft sat rigid in her chair, her silver hair perfectly arranged, her black mourning dress a stark contrast to the cream silk upholstery, and when she spoke her voice carried the weight of generations of aristocratic authority that had shaped Alexander from birth. "I have heard the most disturbing reports," she began without preamble, "that you have been seen calling upon the household of Thomas Hartley, a merchant, and furthermore that you danced with his daughter at the Pemberton ball. Please tell me these reports are exaggerated." Alexander felt his brief happiness evaporate as he faced his mother's fury, but he kept his voice steady as he replied, "They are not exaggerated. I have called upon the Hartleys. Miss Eleanor Hartley is a woman of remarkable intelligence and character, and I intend to continue the acquaintance." The dowager rose from her chair with such speed that her skirts rustled like an angry wind. "Have you lost your senses entirely?" she demanded. "You are the Duke of Ravenscroft. Your lineage can be traced back 8 generations without a single blot. Your father, God rest him, spent his entire life maintaining the dignity and purity of this family, and you would throw it all away for a merchant's daughter, a woman with no breeding, no connections, no name worth mentioning." Alexander felt anger beginning to rise in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Miss Hartley is educated, well-read, thoughtful and kind. She possesses qualities that matter far more than an accident of birth." His mother's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Qualities? You speak of qualities as though they could compensate for the absence of everything that truly matters. What will society say when the Duke of Ravenscroft marries beneath him? What will become of our standing, our influence? And have you forgotten your understanding with the Pembertons? Lady Margaret has been waiting for your proposal, Her family has every expectation that the alliance will be formalized. Alexander thought of Lady Margaret Pemberton with her perfect aristocratic beauty and her eyes like chips of ice, and he felt no pull of attraction or even basic warmth. "I have made no promise to Lady Margaret. There is no formal betrothal. But there is an understanding," his mother insisted, "an understanding forged between your father and Lord Pemberton before your father's death. You know he wished for that match. He spoke of it on his deathbed. He wanted to see the Ravenscroft and Pemberton lines united." The invocation of his father's final wishes struck deep, as his mother had known it would, and Alexander felt the familiar weight of duty settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. His father had indeed expressed hope for the Pemberton match, had spoken of legacy and lineage and the responsibility of carrying forward a name unsullied by common blood. "Very well," Alexander heard himself say. "I will attend dinner with the Pembertons next week. I will give the matter proper consideration." His mother's expression softened slightly into something like relief. "That is all I ask," she said, "that you remember who you are and what you owe to those who came before you." That evening, Alexander sat across from Lady Margaret Pemberton in her family's formal dining room, surrounded by portraits of her noble ancestors, and engaged in 2 hours of conversation that confirmed everything he had begun to suspect, that they had absolutely nothing in common beyond their shared social standing. And as he returned home that night, he realized with perfect clarity that he could not marry without love, could not spend his life with someone who did not see him as anything more than a title and an alliance. The 2 weeks that followed were both torturous and exhilarating for Eleanor, as Alexander called at the Hartley residence 4 more times, each visit stretching longer than propriety strictly allowed, and the gossip that had begun as whispers grew into a steady hum that followed Eleanor whenever she ventured out in society. Though she found she cared less about the speculation than she had imagined possible when faced with the reality of Alexander's attention. On the 6th of November, he arrived with an invitation that made her heart race, even as her practical mind warned her against hope. There was an exhibition at the British Museum featuring recently acquired Greek antiquities, and he wondered if she might accompany him, with appropriate chaperonage, of course, as he remembered her mentioning an interest in classical history during one of their conversations. Eleanor accepted with a composure she did not feel, and 2 days later found herself walking through the museum's marble halls with Caroline serving as chaperone, several discreet paces behind, close enough to preserve propriety, but far enough to allow genuine conversation. Alexander guided her to a display case containing fragments of pottery decorated with scenes from mythology, and as they stood side by side examining the delicate figures painted in ochre and black, Eleanor felt the entire world narrow to this moment, to the warmth radiating from his body mere inches from hers, to the sound of his voice as he spoke about beauty and impermanence, and the human desire to create things that outlast our brief lives. She responded with her own thoughts about how ordinary people, potters and painters whose names were lost to history, had created works that still moved viewers centuries later, and she saw something shift in his expression, a deepening of respect and fascination that made her breath catch. They moved through the exhibition discussing philosophy and art and their own dreams for lives that mattered beyond social standing, and when they paused before a statue of Aphrodite emerging from stone, Alexander reached past her to point out a detail in the carving, and his hand brushed against hers, just the lightest contact of skin against skin, but Eleanor felt it like lightning through her entire body. She glanced up and found him looking at her rather than the statue, his grey eyes intense and searching. And in that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that he felt this connection as powerfully as she did, that whatever was growing between them had moved beyond curiosity or friendship into something far more dangerous. They stood frozen for a heartbeat, that stretched into eternity before Caroline's gentle cough reminded them of where they were, and Alexander stepped back with visible effort, his composure slightly rattled for the first time since Eleanor had known him. As they walked back through the museum toward the entrance, he asked if she might be willing to meet him for a walk in Hyde Park the following Wednesday, and despite every rational voice in her head warning her that she was courting heartbreak, despite knowing that society would never accept a union between them, despite the impossibility of any future together, Eleanor heard herself agree, and felt something bloom inside her chest that she had not allowed herself to feel in years, something that felt remarkably like hope. And for the first time since the night of the Pemberton ball, she permitted herself to imagine, just for a moment, a future in which Alexander Ravenscroft might truly be part of her life. The morning of November the 13th, 1817 arrived with the particular crispness that only London autumn could produce. The air cold enough to require a warm pelisse, but the sky bright with weak sunshine that turned the fallen leaves in Hyde Park into scattered coins of gold and russet. And Eleanor stood at the park entrance with Caroline beside her, feeling her heart beat faster than the chill alone could justify as she watched the path for Alexander's arrival. Caroline squeezed her arm gently, a gesture of support and understanding, and murmured that she would maintain a discreet distance as always, close enough to preserve propriety, but far enough to allow genuine conversation, and Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude for her friend's unwavering support in this impossible situation. Alexander appeared on the path at precisely the appointed hour, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance, and when he reached them and bowed with that combination of formality and warmth that characterized all his interactions with her, Eleanor felt the now familiar sensation of the world narrowing until only he existed in clear focus while everything else blurred into soft background. They began to walk along the serpentine path that wound through the park, past couples taking their own constitutional strolls, and nursemaids with their charges feeding ducks at the pond, and for several minutes they spoke of inconsequential things, the weather and the changing season, and a concert she had attended. But beneath the polite surface, Eleanor sensed something deeper waiting to emerge. It was Alexander who finally broached the subject that clearly weighed on his mind, his voice dropping lower as he said, "I have been thinking a great deal about loneliness, about how it is possible to be surrounded by people constantly, and yet feel utterly alone. Do you know that feeling, Miss Hartley?" Eleanor glanced at him and saw in his expression a vulnerability she had not witnessed before, and she found herself answering with an honesty that surprised her. "I know it well," she said quietly, "though I suspect our experiences of it differ considerably. You are lonely at the center of society's attention, while I am lonely at its periphery. Yet perhaps the result is much the same. The sense that no one truly sees who you are beneath the surface." Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her fully, and his grey eyes held such intensity that Eleanor felt her breath catch. "That is precisely it," he said. "I have spent my entire life being seen only as a title, as the Duke of Ravenscroft, with all the expectations and assumptions that accompany that designation. But you, Miss Hartley, you see me as simply Alexander. You engage with my thoughts and ideas rather than my lineage, and I cannot express what that means to me." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the raw emotion in his voice, and she was about to respond when the sound of carriage wheels on gravel interrupted them, and they both turned to see an elegant barouche drawing to a halt nearby. And Eleanor's stomach dropped when she recognized Lady Margaret Pemberton seated within, her beautiful face arranged in an expression of cold calculation. Alexander stiffened beside her, but did not step away as Lady Pemberton called out in a voice like crystallized honey, "Your Grace, what a pleasant surprise to encounter you here. And is this your little merchant friend? How charming that you take such democratic walks." Eleanor felt the insult land like a physical blow, the dismissive tone and the word little calculated to diminish her. But before she could formulate any response, Alexander moved half a step closer to her side and said with perfect clarity and unmistakable firmness, "Miss Eleanor Hartley is indeed my friend, Lady Pemberton, and I consider myself fortunate in her company. Now, if you will excuse us, we were in the midst of a private conversation." He offered Eleanor his arm, and as she took it and they walked away together, leaving Lady Pemberton staring after them in shock, Eleanor understood with perfect clarity that Alexander had just made a choice, and that choice was her. The morning after their encounter with Lady Pemberton in the park, Eleanor descended to the breakfast room to find her father already seated at the table with papers spread before him, and an expression of barely contained excitement that immediately filled her with unease. For she recognized that look, the gleam in his eye that spoke of calculations and schemes, of seeing opportunities where she saw only the fragile beginnings of genuine connection. Thomas Hartley looked up as she entered and gestured for her to sit. His voice hearty with false casualness as he said, "The Duke called 4 times in these past 2 weeks, Eleanor, and now walks with you in public parks. Surely you understand what this means, what we must do to secure his intentions." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten as she poured tea with hands that wanted to tremble, and she said carefully, "Father, I understand that you see possibility in his attentions, but I must ask you to let this develop naturally, without schemes or pressure." Thomas set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary, his merchant's practicality overriding any sentiment, and said, "Develop naturally, my dear girl. Do you think dukes court merchants' daughters out of the goodness of their hearts without encouragement, without the understanding that certain advantages might follow? I have already drafted a letter to mention my shipping connections and the potential for mutually beneficial arrangements." The words hit Eleanor like cold water, the revelation that her father saw Alexander's interest in her as merely a path to business connections and social elevation, and she felt something rebel inside her chest as she said with quiet firmness, "You will send no such letter, Father. If Alexander calls here, it is because he values my company, not because he seeks commercial partnerships, and I will not be used as bait for your ambitions." Thomas's face flushed with anger and wounded pride, and he stood abruptly, beginning to pace the small breakfast room as he had when making difficult business decisions. And after a long moment, he turned to her with an expression that mingled desperation with determination, and said, "Eleanor, you do not understand. The shipping venture I invested in last spring has failed. I have lost nearly £8,000, and without connections, without some advantage to leverage, we may lose this house, your security, everything I have built." Eleanor felt the world shift beneath her as the truth emerged, the real reason behind her father's sudden enthusiasm for Alexander's attentions, and she was torn between sympathy for his predicament and fury at being reduced to a commodity to be traded for financial stability. And she opened her mouth to respond when the butler appeared at the door to announce that His Grace the Duke of Ravenscroft had called and was waiting in the drawing-room. Thomas's expression transformed instantly into obsequious delight, and he moved toward the door, saying, "Excellent, excellent. I shall receive him immediately." But Eleanor stood and said with a firmness that surprised them both, "No, Father, I will receive him alone, and you will give us privacy." Thomas started to object, clearly seeing this as his opportunity to insinuate himself into Alexander's favor. But something in Eleanor's expression must have conveyed her seriousness, because he reluctantly nodded and said, "Very well. But Eleanor, remember what is at stake here, for all of us." She walked to the drawing-room with her heart heavy with conflicting emotions, love for her father warring with anger at his manipulation, hope for what Alexander might represent against fear that she was being used and perhaps using him in return. And when she entered to find him standing by the window, his profile noble and concerned in the morning light. He turned immediately and crossed to her, and he must have seen something in her expression, because his first words were, "Eleanor, what has happened? You look distressed. Are you well?" Eleanor moved to the center of the drawing room, where the morning light fell in pale rectangles across the carpet, and she found herself unable to meet Alexander's concerned grey eyes as she struggled with how much to reveal, how much to burden him with the sordid reality of her father's financial desperation and social scheming. And after a long moment, she said quietly, "My father has certain expectations regarding your visits here, expectations I do not share and cannot support, and I fear you may be caught in a situation not of your making." Alexander crossed to her immediately, stopping at a respectful distance but close enough that she could see the intensity in his expression, and he said, "Eleanor, please speak plainly. I would know what troubles you." She took a breath and forced herself to meet his gaze, and the words came in a rush. "My father sees your interest in me as an opportunity for business connections and social advancement. He has suffered financial losses and believes that a connection to you might salvage his position, and I cannot bear the thought that your kindness to me might be misconstrued or manipulated for purposes that have nothing to do with genuine regard." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor felt her heart sink, certain that he would now withdraw, that the revelation of her father's mercenary calculations would disgust him. But instead he stepped closer and said with careful deliberation, "Eleanor, I must tell you something, and I ask that you hear me fully before you respond." She nodded, her throat tight with apprehension, and Alexander continued, his voice low and earnest. "I have been calling here these past weeks not out of casual interest or philanthropic condescension, nor certainly to explore business arrangements with your father. I have come because, from the moment we danced at the Pemberton ball, I have been unable to think of little else but you, your intelligence, your honesty, the way you see the world with such clarity and compassion, and I find myself drawn to you in a way I have never experienced with any woman of my acquaintance." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes as she shook her head and said, "Alexander, you must not say such things. You know as well as I that there can be no future for us. You are a duke with responsibilities and expectations, and I am merely a merchant's daughter. We inhabit different worlds that cannot be reconciled no matter what our personal feelings might be." He reached out then and took her hand, the first time he had touched her beyond the formality of a dance, and the contact sent warmth flooding through her entire body as he said, "I know all the reasons why this is impossible. My mother has enumerated them at great length. Society would condemn us. My family would consider it a betrayal of our lineage. And yet, Eleanor, none of those arguments seem to matter when set against the simple truth that I love you." The words hung in the air between them, more shocking than any scandal, more precious than any title. And Eleanor found herself unable to speak through her tears as Alexander continued, "I love you, Eleanor Hartley. I love your mind and your heart and your courage. I love the way you challenge me and see me as simply a man rather than a collection of duties and expectations. And I know this declaration places an impossible burden on you, but I could not continue without speaking the truth." Eleanor withdrew her hand gently and turned away, wrapping her arms around herself, as if to hold together a heart that felt ready to break, and through her tears she said, "I love you too. Alexander, I have loved you almost from the first moment we spoke. But loving you changes nothing about the reality of our situations. You have responsibilities to your family and your name, and I will not be the woman who ruins you or forces you to choose between duty and desire." He came to stand behind her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his presence like warmth from a fire. And he said, What if I told you I have already begun to consider what it would mean to choose? That I have been unable to sleep for thinking of what might be possible if I were willing to sacrifice position for happiness. She turned then to face him, seeing in his expression both anguish and determination, and she said, "I could not live with myself if you made such a sacrifice and came to regret it. If you woke one day and realized what you had given up for a merchant's daughter who could never replace what you had lost." Alexander lifted his hand and very gently wiped a tear from her cheek, and he said, "Then we find ourselves at an impasse, my dear Eleanor, for I cannot imagine a future without you in it, and yet neither of us can see clearly how such a future might be achieved, so perhaps for now we might simply acknowledge what exists between us and continue as we have been, meeting, talking, building something genuine even if its ultimate form remains uncertain." Eleanor knew she should refuse, should end this now before either of them became more deeply entangled, but she found herself nodding and saying, "Yes, yes, we will continue, though heaven knows where this path leads us." Eleanor had not intended to attend the theatre that November evening, but her father had purchased tickets weeks earlier when he still harbored hopes of using social outings to advance his standing. And Thomas Hartley insisted that they maintain appearances despite the uncertain nature of Eleanor's understanding with Alexander, so she found herself seated in the merchant section of the Theatre Royal on a cold Wednesday night, wearing her best gown of deep blue silk and trying not to scan the aristocratic boxes for a familiar profile. The play was a comedy by Sheridan, something about scandal and misunderstanding that felt painfully apt given her own circumstances, and Eleanor forced herself to focus on the stage rather than on the glittering tiers above, where the nobility sat in their private boxes, separated from the common theatre patrons by both physical distance and unbridgeable social chasms. The first act passed pleasantly enough, the actors skilled and the dialogue witty, and Eleanor felt herself relaxing into the entertainment until the intermission brought the house lights up and she saw him, Alexander in the Ravenscroft family box, with the Dowager Duchess on his left and Lady Pemberton on his right, the three of them a portrait of aristocratic perfection that made Eleanor's heart contract with sudden painful recognition of just how impossible their situation truly was. Alexander had not seen her yet, his attention caught by something his mother was saying, his expression polite but distant, and Eleanor found herself studying Lady Pemberton with a kind of sick fascination, noting the woman's flawless posture, her gown of ivory silk that probably cost more than Eleanor's entire wardrobe, the way she touched Alexander's arm with casual possession as if she had every right to his attention. Eleanor forced herself to look away and rose with the rest of the audience to stretch and move about during the interval, and she had just entered the crowded lobby with her father when she heard the voices, a cluster of aristocratic ladies near the refreshment table speaking in tones just loud enough to carry. "That is the Hartley girl, is it not? The one who has been receiving the Duke of Ravenscroft?" said a woman in peacock blue, her vowels clipped with disdain. "The merchant's daughter with aspirations above her station," confirmed another, this one in purple with ostrich feathers nodding in her elaborate hair. "My dear," said a third voice that Eleanor recognized with cold dread as belonging to Lady Ashford, a particular friend of the Dowager Duchess. One might pity her delusion if it were not so brazenly inappropriate. The poor creature actually seems to believe a duke might consider her worthy of serious attention, as if education and a pretty face could compensate for the absolute absence of breeding or consequence. Eleanor felt the words strike like physical blows, and she was frozen in place as the women continued, their cruel amusement building on itself. "I heard she has been reading philosophy with him. Can you imagine? As if intellectual pretensions could disguise her fundamental unsuitability," said Lady Ashford. "The Dowager is beside herself, naturally. She had quite settled on the Pemberton match, and now her son wastes his time with this merchant's nobody. Thomas Hartley had heard as well, and his face flushed with anger and humiliation as he gripped Eleanor's arm. Whether to support her or himself was unclear, and Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, even as she lifted her chin and tried to move past the cruel circle of aristocratic judgment. She made it perhaps 10 steps before her composure broke, and she turned blindly toward the theater's exterior doors, needing air, needing escape, needing to be anywhere but here, where her presumption was so publicly mocked. She pushed through the crowd, hearing her father calling behind her, but unable to stop, unable to face the pity or anger in his expression, and she had nearly reached the doors when she heard another voice, one that made her stop even through her distress. "Eleanor!" Alexander's voice, urgent and concerned, and she turned to see him pushing through the crowd toward her, having somehow seen from his box, or perhaps descended during the intermission, and the sight of him here, leaving his family and Lady Pemberton to pursue her through the public lobby, only made her tears fall faster, because she knew what it would cost him, what scandal it would create. She shook her head and fled through the doors into the cold November night, and she was standing on the theatre steps trying to breathe when he emerged behind her and said her name again, and when she turned he was there, his expression fierce with protectiveness and anger, not at her, but for her. And he said, "I saw them. I saw what those women did, and I went to them immediately and told them that they had just insulted the woman I intend to marry, that their cruelty was a stain on whatever nobility they claimed to possess, and that if they valued my regard or my family's continued civility, they would never again speak your name with anything but respect." The morning after the theatre incident brought Alexander no peace, for he had barely returned to Ravenscroft House when his mother summoned him to her private sitting room, a chamber done in crimson and gold that had always seemed to him more throne room than domestic space, and the Dowager Duchess sat rigid in her chair with an expression of such controlled fury that Alexander knew the confrontation he had been dreading had finally arrived. "You have humiliated this family beyond measure," she began without preamble, her voice cold as winter stone, "publicly declaring your intention to marry a merchant's daughter in front of half of London society, abandoning Lady Pemberton and your family obligations as if they were nothing, as if centuries of Ravenscroft dignity and honour meant less to you than your infatuation with a woman of no consequence whatsoever." Alexander stood before her feeling suddenly like a boy again, called to account for some childhood transgression, but he forced himself to meet her gaze steadily, and said, "Eleanor Hartley is a woman of remarkable character and intelligence, and I will not apologize for loving her or for defending her against cruel gossip." The Dowager rose from her chair with such force that her skirts rustled like battle flags, and she crossed to where Alexander stood, and said with terrible precision, "You will listen to me now, Alexander, for I am going to make this perfectly clear. You are the Duke of Ravenscroft. You hold a title that extends back 7 generations. You are responsible for 12 estates, 4,000 acres of land, and the livelihoods of nearly 600 tenant families. Your duty is not to your own happiness, but to the preservation and continuation of this family's name and position. And that duty requires you to marry appropriately within your own class, to a woman whose bloodline is equal to your own." Alexander felt the weight of her words settling on his shoulders like chains he had worn so long he had forgotten their presence, and he thought of his father on his deathbed, extracting promises about duty and legacy, thought of the portrait gallery with its stern-faced ancestors, whose eyes seemed to follow him with judgment, thought of the hundreds of people whose welfare depended on the Ravenscroft estates remaining stable and prosperous. "Mother," he said carefully, "I understand the responsibilities that come with my position, but surely there must be a way to honor those responsibilities while also choosing a wife I can respect and love." The Dowager laughed, a harsh sound without humor, and she said, "Love, you speak of love as if it were a consideration of any importance. I did not love your father when we married. It was a dynastic alliance that benefited both families and produced 2 sons to carry on the bloodline. Love came later if it came at all, but duty always came first." She returned to her chair and regarded him with eyes that held equal parts anger and something that might have been desperate fear. And she delivered her ultimatum with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You will end this association with Miss Hartley immediately. You will make your apologies to Lady Pemberton and her family, and you will fulfill the understanding that has existed between our families for the past 18 months. Or, Alexander, I swear to you by your father's memory, you will be formally disowned, stripped of your access to the family accounts, and your brother will be named as my heir in your place." Alexander felt the words strike him like physical blows. But beneath the shock was something else, a strange clarity that came from finally seeing the choice laid bare before him without evasion or compromise possible. And he said quietly, "You would truly disown your own son for choosing love over dynastic ambition." Without hesitation, she replied, "I would disown a son who failed in his fundamental duty to his family and his name," and she looked at him with such absolute conviction that Alexander knew she meant every word. Eleanor had not slept the night after the ultimatum, for Caroline had arrived at dawn with the news that the Dowager Duchess had made her threat public among select society circles, ensuring that Eleanor would know the price Alexander would pay for choosing her. And as Eleanor sat in her small bedroom watching the grey November light creep across the walls, she came to the only conclusion her conscience would allow, which was that she loved Alexander too much to let him sacrifice everything for her sake. She spent the morning composing a letter, writing and rewriting the words until they said what needed to be said without revealing how completely her heart was breaking, and the final version released him from any obligation or understanding between them, acknowledged that his duty to his family and tenants must take precedence over personal happiness, and assured him that she had never expected or presumed anything more than the friendship and intellectual companionship they had shared these past weeks. She wrote that she was grateful for the gift of having been seen and valued by someone of his character, that she would treasure the memory of their conversations always, and that she hoped someday he would find contentment in whatever marriage his position required. And she signed it simply Eleanor, not allowing herself any endearment that would make the separation harder for either of them. Caroline found her sealing the letter with trembling hands, and her friend said with unusual sharpness, "Eleanor, you cannot do this. You cannot make this choice for him. He deserves the right to decide what matters most in his own life." But Eleanor shook her head and said, "If I truly love him, and I do, Caroline, I love him more than I knew it was possible to love another person, then I must love him enough to let him go, because how could I live with myself knowing that hundreds of families lost their security because the Duke chose me? How could I bear seeing him years from now regretting what he gave up, resenting me for letting him make such a sacrifice?" Caroline tried for another 20 minutes to dissuade her, arguing that Alexander was a grown man capable of understanding the consequences of his choices, that his happiness mattered as much as his duty, that Eleanor was denying both of them the chance at genuine love. But Eleanor had made her decision with the same quiet determination that had sustained her through years of social dismissal, and she put on her cloak and told her father she needed to deliver a message to Ravenscroft House personally. The walk through London streets felt interminable, every step taking her closer to the end of her brief happiness. And when she reached the imposing townhouse, with its black iron gates and pristine stone facade, she nearly turned back a dozen times before finally handing the sealed letter to the butler and fleeing before her courage could fail completely. She had made it back to her own street when she heard hoofbeats behind her, and she turned to see Alexander on horseback, still in his mourning clothes, without hat or gloves, riding toward her with her letter clutched in his hand and an expression of such fierce determination that her heart stuttered in her chest. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and crossed to where she stood frozen on the pavement, and he said without preamble, "No, Eleanor, absolutely not. You do not get to make this decision for me. You do not get to nobly sacrifice our happiness because you think you are saving me from myself." She tried to speak, to explain, but he held up the letter and said, "I read this, every word, and I understand what you are trying to do. But Eleanor, I have already made my choice. I made it last night while my mother delivered her ultimatum. I made it every time I saw you and felt truly alive for the first time in my life." And he stepped closer and took her cold hands in his and said with absolute conviction, "I am renouncing my title. I am giving up the dukedom, and I am going to marry you if you will still have me as simply Alexander Ravenscroft, with nothing but my name, and whatever future we can build together." December brought cold rain to London that seemed fitting accompaniment to the somber business Alexander had to conduct, and on the morning of the 7th, he arrived at the offices of Whitmore and Sons, the solicitors who had served the Ravenscroft family for 4 generations, carrying documents that would formally dissolve his claim to the dukedom and transfer all entailed properties, estates, and titles to his younger brother James. The senior Mr. Whitmore, a man of 60 with silver hair and the dignified bearing of one who had witnessed decades of aristocratic drama, had tried one final time to dissuade Alexander from this unprecedented course, saying with genuine concern that in his 35 years of legal practice he had never witnessed a peer voluntarily relinquishing a title of such magnitude, and did his grace, he still used the title out of habit, truly understand that once these papers were signed, there would be no legal mechanism for reversal, that he would be permanently severed from the Ravenscroft inheritance and all privileges attendant to the dukedom. Alexander had nodded and said simply, "I understand completely, Mr. Whitmore, and I have never been more certain of any decision in my life," and as he sat at the massive oak desk to review the documents one final time, his mind drifted to memories of his childhood, running through the portrait gallery at Ravenscroft Hall while his father called after him about dignity and decorum, learning to ride on the estate grounds where every tree and stone wall had been Ravenscroft property for 200 years, sitting in his father's study at age 10 while the old Duke explained with absolute solemnity that their family name carried responsibilities that superseded personal desire or individual happiness. He remembered his father's final weeks, the wasting illness that had stolen his strength, but never his conviction about duty. Remembered holding the frail hand while extracting promises about preserving the family legacy, about choosing a wife of appropriate rank, about never bringing scandal or diminishment to the Ravenscroft name. Promises Alexander had believed at the time were sacred vows he would honor until his own death. But as he looked at the legal documents before him, written in precise copperplate hand detailing the transfer of 12 estates totaling 4,000 acres, the relinquishment of his seat in the House of Lords, the formal renunciation of the title Duke of Ravenscroft, and all subsidiary honors, Alexander felt not grief, but rather a profound clarity about what truly mattered, because somewhere in London Eleanor Hartley was waiting, the woman who had seen him not as a title or a collection of properties, but as Alexander, as a man who loved philosophy and could debate for hours about poetry, who laughed at her wit and valued her intelligence, who felt more himself in her presence than he had ever felt in any ballroom or estate office. The door opened, and his mother entered without announcement, and the dowager stood in her black mourning clothes, for she had donned full mourning as if her son were dying rather than choosing a different life, and she made one final desperate appeal, saying that his brother James was only 28 and not prepared for such responsibility, that the tenants and dependents of the estates needed continuity of leadership, that Alexander's father would be devastated beyond measure if he knew his eldest son was abandoning everything their family had built across generations. Alexander rose and faced her and said with steady compassion, "Mother, James has been trained in estate management since he was 15. He knows every property as well as I do, perhaps better because he has always loved that work in a way I never did. And he will be a far better duke than I would have been while harboring resentment and regret. And as for father, I hope wherever he is now, he understands that I tried to honor duty, but I cannot sacrifice love, not for any title or any fortune or any expectation." She looked at him with eyes that held both fury and something resembling grudging respect. And she said, "You are throwing away everything for a merchant's daughter." And he replied simply, "No, mother, I am choosing everything that matters for the woman I love." And there was nothing more to say between them. Alexander sat back down and took up the pen Mr. Whitmore offered, heavy silver that had signed countless documents of import. And with 3 signatures on 3 separate pages, he ceased to be the Duke of Ravenscroft and became simply Mr. Alexander Ravenscroft, gentleman of independent but modest means. And when he walked out of that office into the cold December rain, he felt lighter than he had in years. The news spread through London society with the speed and ferocity of wildfire, jumping from house to house, beginning in the drawing rooms of Mayfair and spreading outward through every level of the aristocracy, until by tea-time on December 8th there was not a household in fashionable society that had not heard the unprecedented, shocking, absolutely scandalous news that the Duke of Ravenscroft had voluntarily renounced his title for a merchant's daughter. In the Pemberton residence, Lady Pemberton received the intelligence from her mother with a face that went from pale to scarlet and back to white again, and she said in a voice trembling with fury and humiliation that she had been made a laughing stock, that everyone would assume the Duke had found her so intolerable that he preferred to give up a dukedom rather than marry her. And her mother tried to console her by saying that at least she had been spared marriage to a man clearly deranged by inappropriate passion. But Lady Pemberton swept from the room and was not seen for 3 days, pleading illness to avoid the pitying and curious looks she knew would follow her everywhere. At various other establishments throughout London, reactions ranged from shock to outrage to scandalized fascination, with older matrons declaring it an affront to every principle of social order, their husbands muttering about the corruption of duty and the dangerous precedent. Such romantic nonsense might set for impressionable younger sons, while a few secret romantics, mostly younger women, trapped in loveless dynastic arrangements of their own, felt something stirring in their chests that they dared not name, but that felt remarkably like hope, or perhaps envy. The gossip at Lady Hertford's card party that evening reached such fevered intensity that no one paid proper attention to their hands, and Mrs. Ashford said she had it on good authority that the Hartley girl had used some form of enchantment or manipulation, because what other explanation could account for a duke behaving so irrationally? To which Miss Thornhill replied with unusual spirit that perhaps the explanation was simply love, which earned her such withering looks that she subsided into silence, but did not retract her statement. In the Hartley residence on a far more modest street, Eleanor sat in the drawing-room, where she had been since Caroline arrived at noon with the news, and she felt as though she were drowning in a sea of conflicting emotions, guilt that Alexander had sacrificed so much warring with joy that he had chosen her, terror about their uncertain future without his wealth and position competing with gratitude for such absolute proof of his love. And she kept saying to Caroline, in a voice edged with panic, that she had tried to release him, that she had given him the opportunity to choose duty. But what if years from now he regretted this decision? What if he came to resent her for the loss of everything he had been born to expect? Caroline was attempting to provide reassurance when they heard a commotion at the front door. Thomas Hartley's voice raised in flustered welcome, and then the drawing-room door opened, and Alexander stood there, still in his greatcoat, with rain glistening in his dark hair, and Eleanor rose on trembling legs as he crossed to her, with an expression of such unwavering determination and love that her fears quieted even before he took her hands in his and said, "Eleanor Hartley, I am no longer a duke. I have no title and no grand estates. I am simply Alexander Ravenscroft with a modest income and uncertain prospects. But I am entirely my own man at last, free to choose my own future, and I choose you. I will always choose you, and if you will have me, I would very much like to ask your father for permission to make you my wife." Caroline excused herself with a meaningful look that Eleanor barely registered, and then the drawing-room door closed, and they were truly alone, and Alexander crossed the space between them with measured steps that seemed both urgent and reverent, still wearing his rain-dampened greatcoat because he had not paused even to remove it before coming to her. And Eleanor found herself unable to speak as he took both her hands in his and said with perfect clarity, "Miss Hartley, Eleanor, I have done what I told you I would do. I have renounced the dukedom and all that came with it, and I come to you now not as a peer of the realm, but as a man who loves you beyond all reason, beyond all expectation, beyond anything I ever imagined I could feel. And if you will have me, if you can forgive the upheaval my feelings have caused in your life, I would be the most honored of men to make you my wife." Eleanor felt tears spilling down her cheeks even as she tried to form words, because the joy warring with guilt was nearly overwhelming, and she said in a trembling voice, "Alexander, you have given up everything, your title, your estates, your position in society. What if someday you regret this choice? What if you wake one morning and resent me for what you sacrificed? I could not bear to be the cause of your unhappiness after you have shown me what true happiness means." He released one of her hands to gently cup her face, wiping away her tears with his thumb, and his expression held such certainty that her doubts quieted even as he spoke, saying, "Eleanor, listen to me carefully because I need you to understand this completely. I have not given up everything. I have given up a collection of properties and a hereditary title, things I was born to through no merit or choice of my own. But what I have gained is the freedom to choose my own life, to love whom I wish, to build something of my own making rather than simply stewarding what others built before me. And most importantly, I have gained you, the possibility of you, the hope of a life with a woman who sees me as Alexander rather than as the Duke of Ravenscroft. And that is worth more than any estate or any seat in Parliament or any invitation to court." She searched his face for any shadow of doubt or regret, and found only steady love and absolute conviction. And she said softly, "Are you certain? Truly certain? Because once we marry there will be no going back. Society will never fully forgive either of us." And he smiled and said, "I am more certain of this than I have been of anything in my entire life." And then, to her complete astonishment, he lowered himself to one knee there in her father's modest drawing-room, assuming the traditional posture of proposal despite having already relinquished every privilege that title had granted him, and he drew from his waistcoat pocket a simple gold ring, not the elaborate Ravenscroft heirloom his mother had been guarding for his future duchess, but a plain band he must have purchased himself, and he said with formal grace, "Eleanor Hartley, would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife, of allowing me to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are worth every sacrifice and more?" And Eleanor felt her heart so full she thought it might burst as she nodded and said through her tears, "Yes, Alexander, yes, I will marry you." And he slipped the simple gold ring onto her finger where it settled as though it had always belonged there, and then he rose and pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time, a tender meeting of lips that tasted of rain and salt tears and absolute promise. And Eleanor knew with perfect certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as equals in love, if not in birth. January brought with it a peculiar mixture of elation and practicality, as Eleanor and Alexander sat together in the Hartley drawing-room on a grey afternoon, discussing matters that felt both wonderfully domestic and somewhat daunting, because while their love was certain and their commitment absolute, the practical realities of building a life without the vast resources Alexander had been accustomed to required careful planning and honest conversation. Alexander explained with admirable clarity that while he was no longer wealthy in the way he had been as Duke of Ravenscroft, he did possess a modest but respectable income from personal investments his grandfather had settled on him years ago, funds that had never been tied to the title and therefore remained his own, and he estimated they could live comfortably, though not extravagantly, on approximately £800 per year, which was more than many genteel families managed on, but represented a dramatic reduction from the tens of thousands the ducal estates had generated. Eleanor listened carefully, her practical merchant daughter's mind calculating household expenses and necessary economies, and she assured him that such an income seemed perfectly adequate for a small household, that she had no need of elaborate gowns or grand entertainments, and Alexander smiled at her with such warmth that she knew he had worried she might find the reduction difficult to accept. The conversation turned to his employment prospects, because while his income provided a foundation, Alexander expressed a strong desire to work, to build something through his own efforts, rather than simply living off inherited investments, and he mentioned possibilities in law or perhaps estate management for others, having been trained since childhood in the complexities of running large properties, even if he would never again run his own. It was at this juncture that Thomas Hartley, who had been conspicuously absent but almost certainly listening from the hallway, entered the room with an expression of studied casualness and proposed that Alexander might consider joining him in a business partnership, suggesting that a gentleman of Alexander's education and connections, even diminished connections, combined with Thomas's commercial acumen and established trade relationships, could prove mutually beneficial. Eleanor watched Alexander's face carefully, knowing this moment represented a significant test of his adjustment to his new circumstances, because accepting such a partnership meant fully embracing the merchant class he had been born to consider beneath him, and she saw the brief flicker of internal struggle before his expression cleared and he extended his hand to Thomas, saying he would be honored to discuss terms, that he had much to learn about commerce but was willing to work diligently. The relief and joy Eleanor felt at his response was profound, because it confirmed what she had hoped but hardly dared assume, that Alexander truly meant what he said about valuing partnership over position, and over the following weeks as they continued planning their wedding, she found herself falling even more deeply in love with this man who approached ledgers and shipping schedules with the same serious attention he had once devoted to parliamentary matters. They decided together on a small, quiet wedding to take place in March, eschewing any pretense of grandeur. And Caroline threw herself into helping with preparations despite the modest scale, declaring that a wedding celebrated in love was worth 10 grand society affairs performed for appearance. Eleanor noticed with some sadness, but no real regret, that the trickle of invitations from society households, never abundant but not entirely absent before, dried up completely once her engagement to the former Duke became known. But she found she did not care, that the opinion of people who valued title over character held no power over her happiness. And when she and Alexander sat together in the evenings, discussing their future home, their values, their hopes for the life they would build together as true equals in every sense that mattered, She knew with perfect certainty that they had chosen correctly. And on a cold evening in late January, they set their wedding date for March 15th, the beginning of spring and the beginning of everything. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft sat in the withdrawing room of the house that was no longer her son's, the late February light filtering through windows she had looked through for 30 years, and felt the sharp ache of absence that had settled in her chest since Alexander had signed away his title and walked out of her life with a finality that terrified her more than she would ever admit aloud. She had told herself for weeks that her fury was righteous, that her son had betrayed centuries of family legacy and dishonored his father's memory. But in the quiet moments when her companions had departed and the servants had withdrawn, she found herself remembering not the duties of a duchess, but the simple joy of a mother watching her child laugh. And she realized with growing discomfort that she had not seen Alexander truly happy in years, perhaps not since he was a boy, before the weight of expectation had settled on his shoulders like armor. Her old friend Lady Westbrook had called that afternoon and had spoken with uncharacteristic bluntness about pride and stubbornness, suggesting that the dowager might consider whether her attachment to bloodlines and tradition was worth losing her son entirely. And though the dowager had bristled at the implication, the words had burrowed into her mind and refused to leave. That evening, she found herself in her private sitting room looking through a miniature portrait of Alexander at age 8, his face bright with uncomplicated joy. And she was struck by the sudden memory of her own wedding day. How she had stood beside the late Duke, feeling nothing but dutiful resignation. How her own mother had assured her that love was unnecessary for a successful marriage, that respect and shared purpose were sufficient, and how she had spent 28 years in a union that was perfectly correct and absolutely empty of genuine affection. She set down the miniature with trembling hands and acknowledged what she had been avoiding for months, that Alexander had chosen something she herself had never possessed, that his happiness with Miss Hartley, with Eleanor, was real in a way her own marriage had never been, and that her insistence on duty and bloodline was perhaps less about family honor and more about her own bitter inability to accept that her son had found what she had been denied. The realization did not come easily or all at once, but rather seeped into her understanding like water into sand, and she found herself wondering with genuine curiosity whether Eleanor Hartley was truly as unsuitable as she had proclaimed, or whether her objections had been rooted in nothing more substantial than habit and inherited prejudice. The next morning she made a decision that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating, and she instructed her secretary to make discreet inquiries about the wedding plans, to learn the date and location without approaching Alexander directly. And when her secretary returned with the information that the ceremony would be small and held in March at a local church with only intimate friends invited, she felt a sharp pang of grief that she was not among that number, but also a flicker of determination that perhaps it was not too late to mend what her pride had broken, and that night she sat at her writing desk and began composing a letter she was not certain she would send, asking her son if she might call upon him to discuss a matter of some importance, and after 3 drafts she finally sealed the letter and had it delivered before she could change her mind. Alexander received his mother's letter on a grey morning in early March and felt a complicated mixture of emotions as he read her careful request for a meeting, because while he had made peace with her absence from his life and was genuinely content with his choice, the carefully formal tone of her note suggested something had shifted in her thinking. And when he showed the letter to Eleanor that evening, she surprised him by immediately saying he should agree to meet with her, that reconciliation with family was always worth attempting, even when the wounds ran deep. They discussed the matter over dinner in their modest rooms, Eleanor pointing out that whatever his mother's faults, she was still his mother and would soon be grandmother to their children. And Alexander found himself moved by Eleanor's generosity toward a woman who had treated her with such coldness, But Eleanor insisted that holding grudges served no one, and that if the dowager was genuinely reaching out, they should respond with grace. It was Eleanor herself who wrote back, suggesting that rather than Alexander meeting his mother alone, perhaps the dowager might prefer to take tea with Eleanor. A suggestion that took considerable courage, because Eleanor knew such a meeting could be deeply uncomfortable, but she felt strongly that if there was to be reconciliation, it should begin with the two women who had been at the heart of the conflict. The dowager's response arrived within 2 days, a brief note accepting the invitation with what Eleanor interpreted as barely concealed anxiety, and they arranged to meet at a tea room in a quiet part of town, neutral territory that belonged to neither of them. On the appointed afternoon, Eleanor dressed with care in a simple but elegant gown of pale blue, and as she prepared to leave, Alexander squeezed her hand and told her she was braver than anyone he had ever known, and she kissed his cheek and said she was simply practical, that they would all be happier if this breach could be mended. The tea room was nearly empty when Eleanor arrived, and she had barely settled at a corner table when the dowager entered, looking smaller somehow than Eleanor remembered, less imperious and more uncertain. And as the older woman approached, Eleanor rose and curtsied with perfect correctness, and the dowager nodded stiffly and took the seat across from her. They ordered tea with awkward formality, the silence between them heavy with everything that had been said and left unsaid. And it was the dowager who finally spoke, her voice tight with suppressed emotion, as she began what was clearly a prepared speech about having had time to reflect on recent events and having come to certain uncomfortable realizations about her own behavior. Eleanor listened without interruption as the dowager acknowledged with obvious difficulty that her treatment of Eleanor had been unjust, that her objections had been rooted in prejudice rather than genuine concern for her son's welfare, and that watching Alexander's happiness from a distance had forced her to confront the emptiness of her own marriage and the hollowness of the traditions she had defended so fiercely. The apology was stiff and imperfect, delivered with the awkwardness of someone unaccustomed to admitting error, but Eleanor recognized the courage it took for this proud woman to humble herself, and when the dowager finally fell silent, Eleanor responded with sincere grace, thanking her for her honesty and saying that she understood how difficult change could be, that she herself had struggled to believe she could be worthy of Alexander's love. Something in Eleanor's gentle acknowledgement of her own doubts seemed to touch the dowager, and her rigid posture softened slightly as she said that Alexander's happiness was undeniable, that whatever her initial reservations, she could not deny that her son was more truly himself now than he had ever been as duke. And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this admission, because it represented a fundamental shift in the older woman's understanding. They talked for another hour, the conversation gradually becoming less formal and more genuine, and when the dowager asked hesitantly whether she might be permitted to attend the wedding, Eleanor reached across the table and touched her hand gently and said that Alexander would be deeply moved to have his mother present, and the dowager's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to let fall as she thanked Eleanor for a generosity she knew she had not earned. The final weeks of February 1818 passed in a blur of quiet preparation that felt both dreamlike and deeply real to Eleanor, who spent her days in activities she had never imagined would be hers, choosing fabric for a wedding gown that would be simple and elegant rather than the elaborate confection society would have expected, meeting with the vicar of the small church where they would be married to discuss the ceremony that would include only those people who genuinely cared for them rather than the grand spectacle a duke's wedding would have demanded, and experiencing moments of profound joy mixed with occasional flashes of doubt that would surface unexpectedly in the quiet hours before sleep, when she would lie awake wondering if she was truly enough for a man who had given up everything for her love. Caroline was with her nearly every day during these weeks, helping with the 1,000 small decisions that went into planning even a modest wedding. And it was Caroline who accompanied her to the dressmaker's shop, where Eleanor chose a gown of ivory silk with delicate embroidery at the sleeves and neckline, understated but beautiful. And when Eleanor stood before the mirror in the fitting room, she saw not the overlooked merchant's daughter she had been for so many years, but a woman who was genuinely loved, and who had found the courage to believe she deserved that love. The guest list was small and carefully considered, including her father Thomas, who had grown more genuinely supportive once he understood that Eleanor's happiness mattered more than his social ambitions. Caroline and her husband, a handful of merchant-class friends who had known Eleanor for years and who celebrated her joy without jealousy, and to everyone's surprise and Eleanor's deep emotion, both the Dowager Duchess and Alexander's younger brother Edward, who had written to say he would be honored to stand with Alexander on his wedding day, and that he admired his brother's courage more than he could express. Alexander was a constant, steady presence throughout these weeks, calling every day and often staying for dinner, discussing practical matters like where they would live after the wedding and how he would contribute to her father's business, but also simply being present with her, holding her hand during quiet evening walks, and listening when she expressed her occasional anxieties about whether she would be a good wife to him. And each time she voiced these doubts, he would tell her with absolute conviction that she was everything he wanted, and that he had never been more certain of any decision in his life. There were moments when Eleanor would catch herself feeling almost guilty about her happiness, wondering if it was right to feel such joy when Alexander had sacrificed so much. But Caroline reminded her firmly that Alexander's choice had been freely made, and that the greatest gift Eleanor could give him was to accept his love without constantly questioning whether she deserved it. And gradually, Eleanor began to internalize this truth, and to allow herself to simply be happy, without the weight of doubt. The evening before the wedding, Eleanor sat in her room looking at the simple gold band Alexander would place on her finger tomorrow. So different from the elaborate family heirloom he might have given a noble bride. And she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her, because she understood that everything in her life had led to this moment. All the years of feeling invisible and overlooked had somehow been necessary preparation for recognizing and accepting true love when it finally came. And as she extinguished her candle and settled into bed for her last night as Eleanor Hartley, she felt not nervousness, but a profound gratitude for the gift of a man who saw her true worth and chose her above everything else the world had to offer. The morning of March 15th, 1818, dawned clear and bright with a quality of light that seemed to bless the occasion. And Eleanor woke in her childhood bedroom with a sense of profound calm settling over her as she realized that this was the day she would become Alexander's wife, the day when all the months of uncertainty and sacrifice would culminate in the simple speaking of vows that would bind them together before God and the small gathering of people who truly loved them. Her father knocked softly on her door as the morning sun streamed through her window. And when she called for him to enter, he came in carrying a tray with tea and toast, his eyes already bright with emotion as he looked at his daughter and told her she had never been more beautiful, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten with affection for this man who had not always understood her, but who had ultimately chosen her happiness over his social ambitions. Caroline arrived shortly after breakfast with 2 other friends to help Eleanor dress, and there was laughter and gentle teasing as they worked together to transform her from merchant's daughter to bride, the ivory silk gown sliding over her shoulders like a whisper, the delicate embroidery at the sleeves catching the light as Caroline fastened the tiny buttons down the back with careful fingers. Eleanor sat before her mirror as Caroline arranged her dark hair in a simple style with small white flowers tucked among the curls, and when she finally stood and turned to face her friends, there was a moment of awed silence before Caroline embraced her and whispered that Alexander was the luckiest man in England, and Eleanor felt tears threaten but forced them back because she would not arrive at the church with red eyes and a blotchy face. The carriage ride to the church felt both endless and far too brief, Eleanor sitting beside her father as the familiar streets of London passed by the window, and Thomas held her hand tightly and told her with uncharacteristic emotion that her mother would have been so proud of the woman she had become, of the courage she had shown in choosing love over convention. And Eleanor squeezed his hand back and thanked him for giving her the freedom to make that choice even when it went against everything he had hoped for her. The small church came into view with its grey stone walls and modest bell tower, and as the carriage stopped, Eleanor could see through the open doors that the interior was filled with spring flowers, simple arrangements of daffodils and early roses that filled the space with colour and sweet fragrance. And she took a deep breath to steady herself before her father helped her down from the carriage and offered her his arm. The gathering inside was small as planned, perhaps 30 people filling the first few pews, and as Eleanor stepped into the doorway and began her walk down the aisle, her eyes found Alexander immediately where he stood at the front beside his brother Edward. And the expression on his face as he watched her approach was one of such complete love and wonder that Eleanor felt every doubt she had ever harbored about her worthiness dissolve in the warmth of his gaze, and she moved toward him with increasing confidence, no longer the overlooked girl from the edge of the ballroom, but a woman who was deeply and genuinely cherished. The wedding breakfast was held at the Hartley home, and Eleanor walked into the familiar drawing room that had been transformed with spring flowers and white ribbons, now feeling like a completely different person than the anxious girl who had paced these floors, wondering if she deserved Alexander's love. And as she stood beside her husband accepting congratulations from the intimate gathering of 30 guests, she felt a profound sense of belonging that had eluded her for so many years. Thomas Hartley rose first to offer a toast, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of his daughter's courage and the joy of watching her find true happiness. And though his words were simple, they carried genuine warmth that made Eleanor reach for his hand in gratitude when he finished, and the guests raised their glasses in agreement. Edward Ravenscroft, Alexander's younger brother who had inherited the dukedom his sibling had renounced, stood next and surprised everyone with the passion of his tribute, speaking of Alexander's integrity and the example he had set by choosing love over empty convention. And he looked directly at Eleanor as he said that she had given his brother a gift beyond price by loving him not for his title, but for the man he truly was. And there were tears in more than one pair of eyes when he concluded by saying he hoped to find such honest devotion himself one day. The Dowager Duchess rose then, and the room fell into a surprised silence, because no one had been certain she would attend at all, much less speak publicly. But she stood with remarkable dignity, and in a voice that trembled only slightly, she said that she had spent many years believing that bloodlines and tradition were the most important things in the world. But watching her son's transformation over these past months had taught her that genuine happiness and true partnership were worth more than any title or estate, and she raised her glass to Eleanor and welcomed her sincerely as a daughter, and the emotion in her words was unmistakable and deeply moving. Caroline spoke last, her voice breaking as she told the gathered friends how she had watched Eleanor struggle for years with feeling invisible and unworthy, and how Alexander had seen immediately what so many others had missed, the intelligence and kindness and strength that made Eleanor extraordinary. And she said that their love story had restored her faith in the possibility of real connection in a world that too often valued surface over substance. And by the time she finished speaking, Eleanor was wiping tears from her cheeks, while Alexander held her other hand tightly. After the toasts and the simple meal of cold meats and spring vegetables, and a modest cake that Caroline had helped arrange, Alexander drew Eleanor away from the gathering and led her into the small garden behind the house where early roses were beginning to bloom and the afternoon sun cast everything in golden light, and they stood together in the privacy of the flowering plants, while the sounds of conversation and laughter drifted through the open windows. Alexander turned to face his wife and told her that he had never imagined he could feel this complete, that standing in that church and speaking his vows had felt like the truest thing he had ever done. And Eleanor responded that she had spent so many years believing she would never be chosen that having him beside her still felt like a dream she might wake from. But he kissed her forehead gently and promised her that this was real and permanent, and that he would spend the rest of his life making certain she never doubted her worth again. And they stood in the garden holding each other as the afternoon light shifted and lengthened around them, two people who had defied every expectation to build something genuine and lasting. By April of 1818, Alexander and Eleanor had settled into the modest London townhouse that would be their first true home together, a narrow brick building on a respectable but unfashionable street where merchants and professional men lived with their families. And though it was perhaps a tenth the size of Ravenscroft House, with its grand staircases and dozens of room, Eleanor found that she loved every corner of this intimate space where she could walk from drawing room to kitchen in less than a minute, and where no servants hovered in every doorway waiting to attend to needs she had not yet expressed. The house had tall windows that let in good light, and a small back garden where herbs grew in neat rows, and where Eleanor imagined they might sit on summer evenings, and she spent her first weeks as mistress of this household, learning the rhythms of managing a home with only 2 servants instead of the army that had maintained her father's residence. Finding unexpected satisfaction in the practical work of planning meals and reviewing accounts and ensuring that fresh flowers stood on the hall table to greet Alexander when he returned each afternoon from the offices where he now worked alongside Thomas Hartley, learning the intricacies of merchant trade. Alexander had approached this dramatic change in his circumstances with a determination that moved Eleanor deeply, rising early each morning to dress in the simpler clothes of a businessman rather than the elaborate tailoring of a duke, walking to the docks and warehouses where her father's enterprises operated, and applying himself to understanding shipping schedules and commodity prices and the 1,000 details that made the difference between profit and loss. And though she knew the work was utterly foreign to everything his upbringing had prepared him for, he never complained or suggested that he regretted the choice that had brought him to this new life. Their evenings became Eleanor's favorite part of each day, the quiet hours after supper when they would sit together in the small drawing room with Alexander reading aloud from whatever book had caught his interest, while Eleanor worked at her needlework or simply watched his face in the firelight. And sometimes they would talk for hours about ideas and dreams and the future they were building together. Conversations that ranged from philosophy to politics to the small domestic details of their daily existence. And Eleanor marveled that she had found a partner who valued her thoughts as much as he cherished her presence. The physical intimacy of marriage had unfolded gradually between them, with a tenderness that made Eleanor grateful for Alexander's patience, and though she would never speak of such private matters even to Caroline, she found profound joy in the quiet moments of connection, in falling asleep each night with his arms around her, and waking each morning to find him beside her, tangible proof that this new life was real and permanent and hers. Their social circle had contracted dramatically, as the aristocratic invitations that had briefly come to Eleanor after her engagement to Alexander ceased entirely once he renounced his title. But she discovered that she did not miss the grand balls and elaborate dinners where she had always felt like an intruder, preferring instead the small gatherings of merchant families and professional people who accepted them without judgment and who valued substance over superficial markers of status. And it was at one of these modest supper parties in late April that Eleanor first felt the unmistakable signs that suggested she might be carrying Alexander's child, a suspicion that grew stronger over the following days until she could no longer deny the truth that filled her with equal parts joy and trepidation as she contemplated how to share this momentous news with her husband. Eleanor spent the better part of a week trying to find the right moment to tell Alexander about the child she was now certain she carried, rehearsing words in her mind as she went about the daily tasks of managing their household, but each time she imagined speaking them aloud, her courage faltered because this news felt so momentous and precious that she wanted the setting to be perfect and the words to be exactly right. She decided finally to plan a special dinner for just the two of them on a Friday evening in early May, when the spring weather had turned warm enough that they could open the windows to let the scent of the garden herbs drift through the house, and she spent the afternoon working with their cook to prepare Alexander's favorite dishes, and arranging fresh flowers on the table and lighting candles even though darkness had not yet fallen, wanting everything to reflect the joy and significance of what she had to share. Alexander arrived home at his usual hour, looking pleasantly surprised by the elaborate preparations, and as they sat down to eat, he asked if they were celebrating some occasion he had forgotten, his expression slightly worried that he might have overlooked an important date, and Eleanor assured him that she simply wanted to do something special for them both, which was true enough, even if it was not the complete truth. They talked through the meal about ordinary matters, about the shipment of tea that had arrived that morning at the warehouse, and about a letter Caroline had sent describing her children's latest antics, and Eleanor found herself studying Alexander's face in the candlelight and imagining him holding their own child, wondering if their baby would have his dark eyes or her lighter coloring, and the thought made her smile in a way that prompted him to ask what she was thinking about with such obvious contentment. Eleanor set down her fork and reached across the small table to take his hand, feeling her heart beating fast with nervous excitement as she told him that she had something important to share, and that she hoped very much that he would be as happy about it as she was. And Alexander's expression shifted immediately to one of concerned attention as he assured her that whatever she needed to tell him, he was ready to hear, and so she took a deep breath and spoke the words simply and directly, telling him that she was carrying their child, and that if her calculations were correct, the baby would arrive sometime in late December or early January. For a long moment, Alexander simply stared at her, as if he could not quite process what she had said, and Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety, wondering if perhaps he was not ready for this responsibility, or if the reality of becoming a father felt too overwhelming given all the other changes he had navigated in the past year. But then his face broke into the most radiant smile she had ever seen, and he stood so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor and came around the table to pull her gently to her feet and embrace her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. He told her that she had given him the greatest gift imaginable, that the thought of being a father to their child filled him with a joy he could barely comprehend, and as they stood together in their modest dining room, with the evening light fading outside and the candles flickering on the table, Eleanor felt a completeness that made all the struggles and uncertainty of the past year fade into insignificance beside this moment of perfect shared happiness. The summer of 1818 unfolded with a slowness that felt both languid and purposeful, as Eleanor's body changed in ways that filled her with wonder and occasional apprehension, her waist thickening despite the loose gowns she now wore, and her skin taking on a luminous quality that Alexander remarked upon frequently as he would sit beside her in the evenings, with his hand resting gently on the curve of her belly, waiting to feel the flutter of movement that the midwife had promised would come soon. Alexander had become almost absurdly attentive to her comfort, insisting that she rest in the afternoons and refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a teacup. And though Eleanor sometimes found his protectiveness excessive, she was also deeply moved by the tenderness it revealed. This man who had once commanded servants in a grand house, now rushing home each day to ensure she had everything she needed, and studying medical texts about childbirth with an intensity that made her smile. Thomas Hartley visited nearly every week with some gift for the expected grandchild, his excitement about the baby almost comically transparent, as he would hold up tiny garments and speculate about whether the child would have Eleanor's colouring or Alexander's height. And Eleanor was grateful to see her father so thoroughly reconciled to the life she had chosen. His initial disappointment about her marrying beneath her previous prospects, completely eclipsed by his genuine affection for Alexander and his pride in the successful business partnership they had forged. That partnership had indeed flourished beyond anyone's early expectations, as Alexander proved to have both a sharp mind for commerce and an ability to negotiate with ship captains and warehouse managers that earned respect throughout the merchant community. And Eleanor knew that this success meant a great deal to him, not because he craved wealth or status, but because he had worried about providing for their family and proving that he could build something valuable through his own efforts rather than inherited privilege. The physical discomforts of pregnancy increased as summer gave way to early autumn, the August heat making Eleanor feel perpetually warm and the weight of the baby pressing on her back in ways that made sleeping difficult. But even in these uncomfortable moments, she felt a deep contentment that came from knowing she was carrying the visible proof of the love she shared with Alexander. A child who would grow up knowing both parents had chosen each other freely and completely. Caroline visited often during these months, bringing news from the wider social world and providing the kind of practical advice about childbirth and infant care that Eleanor's mother would have offered had she lived. And these visits became precious to Eleanor as she realized how much female friendship mattered, especially during such a transformative time. The Dowager had surprised Eleanor by sending several packages as the months progressed. Beautiful baby clothes and soft blankets, accompanied by brief notes that grew slightly warmer with each sending. And though the older woman had not yet visited in person, Eleanor sensed that this was the Dowager's way of extending an olive branch and trying to build a relationship with the grandchild who would carry Ravenscroft blood, even if not the Ravenscroft title. By late September, Eleanor felt as though she had been pregnant forever, her body so altered that she could barely remember what it felt like to move freely. And so when the first genuine labor pains began on a cool evening in early October, she felt both terrified and grateful that the long waiting was finally coming to an end. The labor pains that had begun as a dull, persistent ache in Eleanor's lower back intensified as the evening darkness deepened outside their townhouse windows, and by the time Alexander summoned the midwife and sent word to Caroline, the contractions had become so strong that Eleanor could no longer disguise her discomfort or pretend that perhaps this was merely another false alarm like the one they had experienced 3 days earlier. Alexander paced the hallway outside their bedchamber with the restless energy of a caged animal, his usual composure completely abandoned as he listened to the sounds coming from beyond the closed door. The low murmur of Caroline's encouraging voice and the midwife's calm instructions, punctuated occasionally by Eleanor's involuntary cries of pain that made him feel utterly helpless and desperate to do something useful, even though he knew that this was work only Eleanor could do. The hours stretched on with agonizing slowness as October's chill settled over the city, and Alexander found himself alternately praying to a god he had not addressed directly in years and mentally bargaining with fate, promising that he would be the best father imaginable if only Eleanor and the child came through this safely, because the thought of losing either of them was so unbearable that he could not allow his mind to linger on such possibilities for more than an instant. Sometime past 3 in the morning, when Alexander had nearly worn a path in the floorboards with his pacing, Caroline emerged from the bedchamber with sweat on her own brow and exhaustion in her eyes, but also a tremulous smile that made his heart leap even before she spoke, and she told him that he had a daughter and that both mother and baby were healthy, and that Eleanor was asking for him with a tired insistence that suggested he should not delay. Alexander moved through the doorway in a state that felt suspended between dream and waking, his eyes immediately finding Eleanor propped against the pillows, looking pale and drained, but also somehow luminous in a way he had never seen before. And in her arms, wrapped in soft white linen, was the smallest human being he had ever beheld. A wrinkled, red-faced creature with a surprising amount of dark hair and eyes that seemed to be attempting to focus on this strange new world into which she had been born. Eleanor looked up at him with tears streaming down her cheeks and told him to come meet their daughter, and Alexander approached the bed with the kind of reverence he might have once reserved for approaching an altar, his hands trembling slightly as Eleanor carefully transferred the tiny bundle into his arms, and he felt the astonishing weight of this new life that was somehow part of him and part of Eleanor, and yet entirely her own miraculous self. The baby made a small sound that was not quite a cry, but rather a sort of questioning murmur, and Alexander found himself utterly undone by the fierce wave of love and protectiveness that swept through him. This primal certainty that he would do anything to keep this small person safe and happy, and that his decision to choose love over duty had been vindicated in this perfect moment. Eleanor reached up to touch his arm, and suggested softly that they name her Catherine, after his grandmother, and Rose after her own mother, and Alexander agreed immediately because the names felt exactly right for this child, who represented not just their love, but also the bridge being built between their two families. And as dawn began to break outside, and Caroline quietly took her leave, and the midwife finished her final ministrations, the three of them remained together in the quiet bedchamber. A family complete and wholly content in ways that neither parent could have imagined just 2 years earlier, when they had been merely two lonely people moving through separate worlds that society insisted should never meet. The christening took place on a mild November Sunday at the same modest church where Eleanor and Alexander had exchanged their wedding vows just 8 months earlier. And though the guest list remained small and carefully chosen, the atmosphere inside the ancient stone building felt far warmer and more emotionally resonant than many grand ceremonies Eleanor had witnessed in her youth, perhaps because every person present had chosen to be there out of genuine affection rather than social obligation. Catherine Rose wore the same simple white gown that had been Eleanor's own christening dress, carefully preserved by her father through all the years, and the baby remained remarkably peaceful throughout the preparations, as if she somehow understood the significance of the occasion, her dark eyes alert and curious as she gazed up at the faces gathered around the ancient baptismal font. The true surprise of the day came when the Dowager Duchess arrived in her carriage with Alexander's younger brother, both dressed formally, but without the ostentatious display that might have been expected, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as the older woman approached with an expression that was no longer cold or merely polite, but rather softened by something that looked remarkably like genuine emotion. After the brief ceremony during which Caroline stood as godmother with tears streaming freely down her cheeks, and Thomas Hartley beamed with such obvious pride that several guests smiled at his transparent joy, the Dowager approached Eleanor and Alexander with a tentative quality to her movements that suggested she was not entirely certain of her welcome, and she asked in a voice that trembled slightly whether she might hold her granddaughter for a moment. Alexander handed Catherine to his mother without hesitation, and Eleanor watched as the Dowager looked down at the tiny face with an expression of such naked tenderness that it transformed her entire countenance, making visible for perhaps the first time the woman she might have been, had her own life not been so rigidly constrained by duty and expectation. The Dowager spoke softly to the baby about her grandfather who had died before seeing this moment, and about the Ravenscroft blood that ran in her veins regardless of titles or estates. But then she looked up at Eleanor with eyes that were bright with unshed tears, and said clearly enough for those nearby to hear that Catherine was fortunate to have a mother of such character and grace, and that she hoped Eleanor might find it in her heart to consider the dowager not as an adversary but as family, imperfect and late to understanding, but sincere in her desire to make amends. Eleanor felt her own throat tighten with emotion as she assured the older woman that forgiveness was freely given, and that Catherine would indeed know her grandmother, and in that moment Eleanor understood that the reconciliation was complete, that the family which had once seemed so determined to exclude her had finally recognized that love and worth could not be measured by pedigree alone. Alexander's brother proved equally warm as he held his niece with surprising competence for an unmarried man, and declared that she would certainly grow up to be a heartbreaker, and the easy affection between the brothers made Eleanor grateful that Alexander's choice had not permanently fractured those bonds. The small reception that followed at the Ravenscroft townhouse felt less like a formal christening celebration and more like a gathering of people who genuinely cared for one another. With Thomas holding court about his granddaughter's obvious brilliance, and Caroline organizing everything with her characteristic efficiency, while the dowager sat quietly in a corner, simply watching the scene with what looked like peaceful acceptance. And as afternoon light slanted through the windows and illuminated the gathering, Eleanor caught Alexander's eye across the room and saw in his expression the same profound contentment she felt. This sense that they had built something real and lasting from their choice to follow love rather than convention. Before departing, the dowager made one final gesture by commissioning a portrait painter she knew to create a family painting of Alexander, Eleanor, and Catherine. And though Eleanor initially protested the expense, the older woman insisted, with a firmness that reminded Eleanor of Alexander's own stubborn determination, saying that every family deserved to have such moments preserved, and that she would consider it a personal gift to her granddaughter, who would someday want to see herself as an infant, surrounded by parents who had chosen love above all else. And as the painter arrived the following week and began his preliminary sketches, Eleanor realized that this portrait would represent not just their small family, but the complete transformation of everything that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier, when she had stood at the edge of a ballroom believing herself invisible and unworthy of notice. The winter months of 1818 and into early 1819 brought with them a gradual but unmistakable shift in the attitudes of certain segments of London society toward Alexander and Eleanor, a change that began not with any dramatic gesture or public declaration, but rather through the quiet accumulation of observations that even the most rigidly conventional members of the ton found difficult to dismiss entirely. Word had spread through the merchant and professional classes about Alexander's remarkable aptitude for business, how he had taken Thomas Hartley's already successful trading concern and expanded it through innovative contracts with manufacturers in the northern counties, demonstrating a head for figures and negotiation that surprised those who had assumed a duke would be utterly useless in practical commerce. And even some aristocrats who had initially scorned his choice began to admit grudgingly that the man possessed integrity and capability that had perhaps been wasted in the ornamental role of titled nobility. Eleanor herself became a figure of increasing interest to a younger generation of ladies who had grown weary of the suffocating restrictions that governed their own lives, and on several occasions when she ventured into the better shops or attended concerts that Alexander's modest income could afford, she found herself approached by women who expressed admiration for her courage and who asked tentative questions about how one might live authentically rather than according to society's demands, conversations that surprised Eleanor with their hunger for something more meaningful than endless social performances. The small townhouse that Alexander and Eleanor occupied became over those months an unexpected gathering place for a diverse collection of individuals who might never have mixed in traditional aristocratic settings, with evenings that brought together successful merchants, reform-minded younger sons of noble families, writers and artists seeking patronage based on merit rather than connections, and even the occasional radical thinker whose ideas about social equality would have been scandalous in more conventional drawing rooms. And Eleanor discovered that she possessed a natural gift for creating an atmosphere where genuine conversation could flourish and where people were valued for their thoughts and character rather than their pedigree. Alexander found deep satisfaction in these gatherings that reminded him of his university days when ideas had mattered more than titles, and he and Eleanor became known among this growing circle as quiet revolutionaries who proved through their daily example that happiness and purpose could exist outside the narrow confines of traditional social hierarchy. Their very presence together, a kind of ongoing argument against the arbitrary barriers that kept people confined to the circumstances of their birth. Even the Dowager Duchess remarked during one of her increasingly frequent visits to see her granddaughter that she had never seen Alexander so fully alive and engaged with the world. And though she still maintained her connections to traditional society and would never fully abandon her belief in the importance of lineage, she had begun to understand that perhaps true nobility resided in character and choice rather than in ancient names and inherited estates. When an invitation arrived in late January for a modest ball being hosted by a baronet known for his progressive views and his willingness to include guests from various social ranks, Eleanor felt Alexander's questioning gaze upon her as they sat together in their small library, with Catherine sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby, and she understood that he was asking whether she felt ready to return to the kind of setting where their relationship had begun, whether she wished to face again the society that had once dismissed her so cruelly. And after a long moment of consideration, Eleanor met his eyes and told him that, yes, she thought perhaps it was time. Because she was no longer the invisible woman who had stood at the edge of the Pemberton ballroom believing herself unworthy of notice, and she had nothing to prove to society but perhaps something to demonstrate about the possibility of building a life on love rather than convention. The February evening in 1819 carried with it the same crisp quality that Eleanor remembered from that transformative night more than a year earlier, when she had first entered a grand ballroom, expecting nothing and finding everything, and as the carriage bearing her and Alexander approached the well-lit townhouse of Sir Edmund Hartwick, whose progressive views and eclectic guest lists had made him something of a controversial figure among the more traditional aristocracy, Eleanor felt Alexander's hand find hers in the darkness and squeeze gently, as if he understood without words the significance of this moment, this return to the kind of setting where their impossible love had first begun. Unlike that earlier occasion when she had dressed in her most modest gown and entered with her head bowed, expecting invisibility, Eleanor now wore a dress of deep sapphire silk that Alexander had insisted on commissioning from the same dressmaker who served several titled ladies, not ostentatious, but beautifully cut to flatter her figure, which had recovered remarkably well from Catherine's birth. And as she stepped from the carriage with Alexander's assistance, she stood straight and met the eyes of arriving guests with quiet confidence, because she was no longer the uncertain merchant's daughter, hoping to avoid notice, but rather a woman who had been chosen and cherished, who had proven her worth through the simple fact of being loved by a man who had sacrificed everything to claim her. The ballroom itself was smaller than the grand Pemberton affair, but no less elegant, with musicians playing in the gallery and couples already moving through the familiar patterns of a country dance. And Eleanor noticed immediately the mixed nature of the gathering with titled nobility, mingling somewhat awkwardly with wealthy merchants and professional men, the kind of social experiment that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, but which now reflected the slowly shifting attitudes of a new generation, less convinced that birth alone determined value. Alexander kept Eleanor's hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm as they entered, and she felt the turning of heads and the ripple of recognition as people noted their arrival, some faces showing disapproval or curiosity, but others displaying unmistakable warmth, particularly among the younger guests who had heard the romantic story of the Duke, who gave up everything for love, and who saw in Alexander and Eleanor's presence together a kind of living proof that happiness might be found outside the narrow confines of traditional expectation. When the musicians struck up a waltz, that same dance that had first brought them together, Alexander turned to Eleanor with a smile that held both memory and promise, and asked with exaggerated formality whether Mrs. Ravenscroft might do him the honor of dancing with him, and she accepted with matching playfulness, allowing him to lead her onto the floor, where they joined the circling couples in movements that felt both achingly familiar and entirely new, because everything had changed since that first dance, when she had been terrified and disbelieving, and he had been curious and conflicted. As they turned together, Eleanor caught sight of Lady Pemberton standing near the refreshment table, and the brief moment when their eyes met told a story more powerful than any words could convey. For Lady Pemberton had married the previous summer to an elderly marquis whose fortune was legendary but whose temperament was notoriously cold, a match that had satisfied every requirement of rank and connection while providing not even the pretense of affection, and the brittle quality to her expression as she watched Alexander and Eleanor dance with obvious joy and intimacy, suggested that she understood exactly what she had gained in title and lost in possibility, though Eleanor felt no triumph in the observation, but only a kind of sad recognition that they had chosen such different paths. Alexander seemed to sense the moment of connection because he leaned closer as they turned and whispered against her ear that she was the most beautiful woman in the room, and that he would choose her again without hesitation given the same choice, and Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at words that she knew were not mere flattery but simple truth, the kind of honest devotion that had become the foundation of their daily life together. They remained at the ball for perhaps 2 hours, long enough to converse with friends from their growing circle of progressive thinkers, and to demonstrate through their presence that they had not been broken or diminished by society's earlier rejection. But as the evening stretched toward midnight, Alexander caught Eleanor's eye with a questioning look, and she nodded her agreement, both understanding without discussion that they preferred the quiet intimacy of their own home to even the most welcoming of social gatherings, and as they made their farewells and stepped out into the February night with stars visible between scattered clouds, Eleanor realized that this return to the ballroom had provided exactly what she needed, not vindication or revenge, but simply the peaceful recognition that she had made the right choice, that love and authenticity mattered more than any amount of social approval, and that she and Alexander had built together something far more valuable than titles or position, something that would endure long after the whispers and scandals had faded into memory. The spring of 1820 arrived with that particular quality of golden light that seemed to Eleanor emblematic of hope and renewal, and as she stood in the small garden behind their townhouse, watching Catherine chase butterflies among the flowering herbs, while her hand rested unconsciously on the gentle swell of her belly, where a second child grew steadily toward birth in late summer, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment of such profound and unexpected happiness, scarcely 3 years having passed since that October evening when she had stood at the edge of a grand ballroom, believing herself invisible and unworthy of notice, resigned to a life of quiet obscurity as the unmarried daughter of a merchant whose wealth could never compensate for her lack of noble blood. Alexander emerged from the house carrying the account books that had become his constant companions as his partnership with Thomas Hartley continued to flourish beyond anyone's initial expectation. his natural intelligence and years of managing ducal estates having translated remarkably well into the world of commerce, where he had proven himself adept at identifying profitable opportunities and negotiating favorable terms with manufacturers and distributors across England, and increasingly on the continent as well. And Eleanor felt the familiar warmth in her chest as she watched him set the books aside to scoop Catherine into his arms and lift her high above his head, while the child shrieked with delighted laughter. This man who had once borne the weight of ancient title and centuries of aristocratic expectation, now finding his greatest joy in the simple pleasures of fatherhood and honest work. Their life together had settled into patterns that brought daily contentment rather than dramatic passion. Though Eleanor still felt her pulse quicken when Alexander looked at her with that particular expression of tender devotion that suggested he would choose her again, without hesitation, were he given the chance to relive those agonizing decisions, and she knew with absolute certainty that the sacrifice he had made in renouncing his dukedom weighed on him not at all compared to the richness he had gained in their partnership of equals, their shared purpose in raising children who would know their own worth regardless of society's arbitrary measures, their growing circle of friends who valued ideas and character over pedigree and position. The business that Alexander and Thomas had built together now employed nearly 30 people in their London offices and warehouses, providing decent wages and fair treatment that had earned them loyalty and respect among workers who knew themselves valued beyond mere economic utility, and Alexander had discovered that he possessed both aptitude and passion for this kind of productive enterprise in ways that the ceremonial duties of nobility had never engaged, telling Eleanor often that he felt more truly himself in negotiating a contract or solving a logistical challenge than he ever had sitting in the House of Lords listening to endless debates about matters that seemed increasingly disconnected from the lives of ordinary people struggling to survive in rapidly changing times. The Dowager Duchess had become a regular visitor to their home, her initial stiff attempts at reconciliation having gradually softened into genuine affection for Eleanor and obvious adoration of her granddaughter, and she had confessed during one particularly honest conversation that watching Alexander's happiness had forced her to confront the emptiness of her own dutiful marriage, and to recognize that perhaps the social structures she had spent her life defending served ultimately to constrain human flourishing rather than protect anything truly valuable. An admission that had moved Eleanor deeply and strengthened the unlikely bond forming between two women who had begun as adversaries but discovered unexpected common ground in their love for Alexander and their recognition that authenticity mattered more than appearance. As Catherine ran back toward Eleanor demanding attention, and Alexander followed with that smile that still had the power to make Eleanor feel chosen and cherished, she reflected that their story had become something of a quiet legend among younger people questioning traditional expectations. And while they had never sought to be revolutionaries or reformers, they had discovered that simply living according to their values and refusing to accept society's limitations created a kind of ongoing argument for the possibility of choosing love and purpose over duty and convention. Their very existence together proving that happiness could be found outside the narrow paths that birth and circumstance seemed to dictate. And as Alexander's hand found hers and their daughter settled between them in the warm spring sunshine, Eleanor understood that this simple moment contained more genuine nobility than all the titles and ceremonies and grand estates she had once believed forever beyond her reach. The afternoon light of late summer in 1823 filtered through the windows of their townhouse library, where Eleanor sat in the comfortable chair that Alexander had purchased specifically because it supported her back during the long hours she spent reading to their children. And as she looked up from the letter she had just finished writing to Caroline, who now lived in the countryside with her growing family, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how the passage of 6 years since that transformative October evening had proven beyond any doubt that the choices she and Alexander had made were not merely romantic gestures, but the foundation of a life rich with purpose and meaning that extended far beyond their own happiness. Catherine at age 5 had grown into a bright and curious child who asked endless questions about why some people had titles and others did not. Discussions that Eleanor and Alexander navigated carefully to instill values of equality and merit while acknowledging the realities of the world their daughter would inhabit. And their son William, at 2 years, displayed his father's thoughtful temperament along with a stubborn independence that made Eleanor smile with recognition of her own nature. The business that Alexander had built alongside Thomas Hartley had expanded beyond even their optimistic projections, now employing more than 75 people and establishing trade relationships across Europe. And Alexander had discovered a particular talent for identifying promising young people regardless of their birth and providing them opportunities to develop skills and advance based on their contributions rather than their connections, creating within their enterprise a small model of the more just society they both believed possible. Dear friends, Eleanor wrote now directly to those who might hear her story. I tell you these things not to boast of happiness achieved, but to offer hope that the limitations society places upon us need not define the boundaries of our lives, because there was a time not so very long ago when I believed myself destined for invisibility and resignation, when I accepted as unchangeable truth the message that my worth could be measured by circumstances of birth over which I had no control, and it required the extraordinary gesture of a man willing to sacrifice everything he had been taught to value for me to begin understanding that authentic love recognizes qualities that pedigree and position can never confer. The journey has not been without difficulties, as Alexander sometimes feels the weight of responsibility for those who depended on the estates he no longer controls. And there are moments when Eleanor wonders whether their children will face harder paths because of choices their parents made. But these concerns fade in comparison to the daily reality of a partnership built on genuine respect and shared purpose, where decisions are made together and burdens carried jointly, where neither party must perform a role or maintain appearances, but both can simply be their truest selves. If you find yourself trapped by expectations that feel immovable, if you have been told that your dreams are inappropriate to your station or your desires incompatible with your duty, I encourage you to remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act according to your deepest values despite that fear, and that sometimes the greatest nobility lies not in preserving ancient privileges, but in recognizing common humanity and choosing love over legacy. The sound of Alexander's footsteps on the stairs brought Eleanor back to the present moment, and when he entered the library with Catherine riding on his shoulders and William toddling behind, clutching his father's coat, she felt once again that profound gratitude for the unpected gift of this life they had created together. And as Alexander met her eyes across the room with that look of continued devotion and partnership that had only deepened with time, Eleanor understood that their story would endure not because it was perfect, but because it was true. A testament to the transformative power of seeing and being seen, of choosing authenticity over approval, and of believing that love might indeed be enough to build a life worth living.